I'm really grateful to be here. I don't get to be in rooms like this very often. I'll kind of explain my situation at BYU. We have very good kind of advantages and challenges for me personally, teaching Eastern religions or teaching Buddhism specifically at BYU. I teach in religious education. It's its own college at BYU. It has 70 faculty members, divided into 2 departments of ancient scripture, which is mainly biblical, plus Book of Mormon studies. And then I actually teach Buddhism in a department called Church History and Doctrine, as strange as that may seem. But we do have a few different comparative religion classes on Islam, American Christianity, but I'm the only faculty member currently, and probably inevitably, who does anything in Asia, who does anything outside the Abrahamic traditions. And so there is advantages to that. We teach a kind of a quasi-minor in religion at BYU, so all our students are required to take 7 courses as part of their general education requirement. So I don't have any problems getting students to take my classes. And I think maybe the reason for me to join the faculty at BYU, moving from University of Arizona, was that it is a religious studies department that's very well funded because of its ecclesiastical or its parochial kind of backing. In talking about, I think I have kind of a similar classrooms to Winston, and talking about coming out kind of with your faith identity. When I taught at University of Arizona, I'd have students come up to me afterwards and say, "I don't know what religion you are," and my my department, that was their favorite. That was their favorite student feedback for me. They're like, "That is so awesome," right? That they can't figure out, that you're from Utah and that you're a Mormon or whatever, and they thought that was wonderful. That we get mentioned in faculty meetings. And then I went to BYU, and 2 students said the same thing, and my department, my department chair said, "If you want to work here, that has to end." And so, because they wanted to make sure that that they knew that there was some sort of devotional place from the parochial background. Oh, we're recording this, right? Oh, it's out there anyway. Anyway, I want to show you some of the advantages I found at BYU, and I feel bad because it took me like 3 years to figure this out. But BYU has specific aims of an education. This is the aims of a BYU education. I'm just going to read this a little bit to you. These are the 4 bullet points, but above these bullet points says, BYU seeks to develop students of faith, intellect, and character who have the skills and the desire to continue learning and to serve others throughout their lives. These are the common aims of all education at BYU. Both those who teach in the classroom and those who direct activities outside the classroom are responsible for contributing to this complete educational vision. A BYU education should be, and then the 4 points: spiritually strengthening, intellectually enlarging, character building, and leading to lifelong learning and service. I think this was built, or this was designed within the context of a Christian context, or even within an LDS context. After about 3 years at BYU, I said, this actually opens up a lot of possibilities that I can do in the classroom about bringing kind of Buddhist spiritualism as an experience into the classroom, because these are the aims, and they're not necessarily only for them building a faith in the parochial vision or the parochial kind of parameters of the sponsoring institution, that I can really in some ways show how Buddhism can in some ways create different sorts of enriching kind of lives, spiritual lives, emotional lives, social, and what have you. And so I'm going to kind of give you kind of a literature review of how I've kind of built this. A few years back I read a book called from Paul Knitter, who is within the ecclesiastical Christian tradition, and his book called "Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian." I don't know if I've gone as far as Paul, but I certainly, if Buddhism isn't essential to kind of my spiritual path or to kind of who I think I am today, it certainly has been amazingly enriching. And I see the importance of Buddhism in kind of helping me understand myself and understand others in a much more enriched and spiritual way. And then a few years ago, I read a book by Robert Wright called "Why Buddhism is True." I was extremely interested and excited to read this book, because, of course, I think we have this with all books, right? You have this expectation what the book was going to be. And I thought it was going to be about basically the very rich and I guess you could say spiritually true part of the metaphysics of Buddhism, right? That there would be a formulation of how Buddhism, in some ways, offers its followers meaning. And it's not necessarily about that. It's a very good titled book, and that's always nice. And the early kind of part of the book is about basically the ways in which Buddhism has brought kind of meaning to its followers. But throughout the book, it's basically almost a book about the kind of medical proofs of mindfulness. And those things are important as well. But I thought it was a very sterile look at Buddhism because it was looking at it from a very scientific and almost experiential medical way of looking at its possible verifications. And then lastly, I started reading this book by Evan Thompson. It just came out just a few months ago. It says, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. There seems to be a whole line of books like this, right, starting with Bertrand Russell. And I like this book. And he says that he's not a Buddhist because of the religious exceptionalism that he found in it. Now, I wasn't sure that that was innately Buddhist. In fact, I think there's some things in Buddhism that aren't, right, necessarily, I guess you could say, religiously exceptional or religiously exclusive, right? That's a very open. I think Evan Thompson, from my early reading of this book, is talking about, right, American Buddhism. And, yeah, I mean, the idea of exceptionalism might be intrinsic to the idea of Americanism. I'm not sure. Maybe some of you agree with that. But in looking at religious exceptionalism, I realized that was an important battle, an inevitable battle in my classroom, because most people in my classroom, I could certainly go toe-to-toe with the I guess you could say the racial and religious homogeneity of my classrooms with probably anybody in the room. Most of my classroom is about 90 to 95% white, and almost all of it is LDS or Mormon. And most of those have served an 18 to 24 month proselytizing mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're what we call returned missionaries. And so, probably appropriately, they have a lot of exceptionalism, a lot of exclusive belief in their own religion. So how do I bring basically an experience of Buddhism into the classroom? And so that was kind of my theoretical kind of issue, is how do I in some ways show to a strong exceptionalist audience the importance of religious pluralism and the ways in which Buddhism could offer even the most strict religious exclusivist some sort of enrichment. And then I realized that the aims of Byu Education would allow me to do this, that I could have a lot more leeway in basically incorporating kind of spiritual things into the classroom. And so we started that. I started that by doing exactly what Rachel was talking about, what Dr. Payne was talking about. And I got rid of all my tests. This was extremely, how would you put this? This was extremely anxiety-producing for most of my students. So when they would go into the classroom, and they're like, when's the midterm, when's the final? I'm like, there isn't a midterm or a final. They're like, well, how do I get evaluated? I'm like, the class isn't so much about evaluation as about preparation and enrichment. And they really didn't like that. They really had a problem. And they said, there'll be things that you turn in and we'll give you scores for them, but they're not necessarily going to be evaluated. And I realized that I was giving them a little bit of the control. But I also realized that if I wanted this to be, in some ways, an experience of engaging Buddhism, that they had to have that control, that there is a certain part of the sincerity that you cannot demand, right, as an instructor. You kind of, and I just had to be, I had to become much more compassionate with them, right? Because I knew that some students were taking these assignments and really engaging in them and really kind of gaining an experience, and some weren't. And you want all of your students to kind of do what you want, right? Or all of your students, I mean, I think it's very kind of, from a good place, you all want them to have the experience that you want them to have. And I just started to look at my students and see some that were engaging the topics very, the experiences very sincerely, and ones that weren't, and just kind of, in a way, saying, okay, this student is taking my class at the right time. This person is here 2 semesters early, right? So I don't want to be so kind of judgmental, or in some ways, try to be critical of them. And then, of course, but I had to in some ways be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit open about the variety of engagement I was going to get from my students. So we got rid of the evaluations and we started to work towards experience and enrichment and preparation. So the first thing that we did is that we started class with a meditation experience. This is really good. This kind of weeds out the class. Again, I don't have too much issue about having enough people enroll because they have to take these classes in order to graduate. And so we usually meditate about 5 minutes at the start of class. At the first day of class, I always make sure we meditate about 10 to 12 minutes because it's a good way to kind of get people who may not be comfortable with that to reconsider. I've only had one person leave during the meditation session, but I've had several leave after. And what we do is we just start and we explain to them the method we're going to teach them that day, whether it's metta, whether it's metta or loving kindness, whether it's we actually go outside and walk, right? Usually not on a day as cold as this, but sometimes you have to in Utah. Prostration, meditation, breathing, body scan, visualization. We go through all these and try to basically give them the kind of lineage or the route in which we see these. And then I started requiring them to meditate every day. I've been doing that using the iPhone app Insight Timer. There are several, but Insight Timer is free. So that's always better for your students than making them buy something that some of the other ones require. And we allow them to basically use any method they want, but we'd want them to focus on one method throughout the semester eventually. 2 to 3 times during the semester, they'll have to turn in a reflection through Canvas online about how their meditation is going. And it's been very, very positive. A lot of people have really enjoyed this. I tell students, I'm like, hey, it's okay, you can't get meditation wrong, so if you're going to send me in a reflection that says, I hate meditation, that's as good as any other one, right? And then what's really nice, and this is why I stopped using Insight Timer. Insight's kind of a very kind of, I don't know, competitive person. Insight Timer will give you stars, right? And so it's kind of a motivation system. And so I was using Insight Timer almost daily. And then there'd be days in which it'd be like 11:30 and I hadn't meditated. And I'll be like, shoot. And I'll like click it 3 times because, even a 1-second meditation session counts for that day. And then I was like, okay, this is very anti-meditative. And so I stopped using it because I got too competitive with getting the stars. But what's nice is that the stars allow me to see my students' progress. I can see how many days in a row they've actually meditated and whether they're taking it. Now again, I can't necessarily evaluate the quality, but at least I can see if they're doing it. So that's the way that I've incorporated meditation into the class. And it's actually gone quite well. I think a lot of students have actually liked it quite a bit. And then the other part was reading. We wanted them to have an experience with reading. And so what I've been using lately is Jushi's reading methods. There are a couple good anthologies of Jushi's writings, and so we have them read a couple chapters on reading. So Jushi is about for today's kind of college classroom, very kind of the antithesis to that. He wants people to read less. So he's like, if you're reading, 50 pages, read 25 pages. If you're reading 1 page, read a half a page, and read that half a page 10 times, right? One thing that he says over and over again is that you have to wait for the text to open to you. He's about what some people have called, it's very close to Lectio Divina in the Catholic tradition. What he says is the book has to open to you, and until that happens, you have to abide in reverence. And so we really look at that, and we talk about whether Jushi's talking, first of all, about all literature. We have that question, could you use Jushi and read anything? Right? A good example of that is, of course, there's a couple of Harvard Divinity School students who are almost through the entire series now, but several years ago started this podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and actually used the process of Lectio Divina to read each chapter of Harry Potter. And so we ask those questions: can you read anything, or is this a method for engaging Scripture, in a very broad world kind of definition of that term? We have them, for the Buddha section of the class, engage the Heart Sutra, because it's short, as Jushi would want it, and because I can require them to read it over and over and over again. We chant it in class. We basically read it together in class without any sort of chanting rhythm or liturgical kind of system. And then we include the liturgical system. We use Dharma drums, morning Liturgy, which is actually, there's an audio online, which is great, so you can actually chant along with one of the monks from Dharma Drum. And then we have them copy it, both in English and in Chinese. And so they have to, they trace it in Chinese, right? Just like a traditional sutra copying, or shakyo in Japanese. And then we offer points, or we offer engagement points for if you want to memorize it. Most students don't, but some students do. Some of my students can actually recite the Heart Sutra in English or in Chinese by memory, which is nice. And so we really are helping them engage the text of the scripture, and we're asking them to have an experience with the text. So it's just kind of explicit, right? We want you to have some sort of emotional or spiritual connection to the text, as reading as a transformational experience. We want to see what happens to you as you read it. The last thing that I wanted to discuss as far as doing this kind of approximating the aims of a Byu Education through devotional experiences is to have them look at devotional exemplars. We have them look at Sheng Yan, who was the start of Dharma Drum, or Fa Gushan in Taiwan. We talk about his process of kind of leaving Shanghai to find kind of religious freedom in Taiwan. We talk about his experience in actually going to a cave in southern Taiwan and living there for 6 years by himself. And so we talk about these things, and because we're talking to people who have spent 18 to 24 months full-time church kind of service, and we have them look at Buddhists and say, would you do this? Would you live in a cave for 6 years? We look at the marathon monks of Mount Hiei, right? These monks near Kyoto, who basically go around to several temples and shrines and basically semi-run a marathon for 100 straight days, and then go into a temple and basically stay there meditating for about 8 days without sleep, food, or water. And we ask them, would you do this? Is there something you can learn here by their devotional practice and by their devotional commitment? It's basically just this idea of expanding to Buddhism, the Viktor Frankl idea of if you have a why to live, you can put up with almost any how. And then, of course, lately we've been looking at Kobodaishi, this 9th century Buddhist monk who brought part of esoteric Buddhism to Japan, called it Shingon, and his establishment of the 88 Temples of Shikoku, and basically spending years in kind of asceticism and basically chanting and fasting and praying in different kind of places around the island of Shikoku, the 4th largest island on Japan, in Japan's archipelago. And we've been looking at basically the Shikoku pilgrimage. So when I interviewed for BYU, I was pretty happy teaching Buddhism at the University of Arizona. And so they're like, well, would you like to come? And they're showing me all this stuff that we could work on, or that they could offer me. And I said, well, if you'll give me 3 weeks in Shikoku, I'll come. Right? So if you'll fund us, right? You got to go for the the stars, right? You got to go for everything at that initial hire. And maybe they didn't understand what I said, right? There's a good chance they didn't understand what I was talking about, because they're like, oh, sure, we can do that. So in 2014, I was able to spend those weeks in Shikoku, able to complete the Shikoku pilgrimage, and then went back for further research in 2017. Since that time, I've been asking to display what I had collected in Shikoku in one of these display cases that's on the first floor of the Joseph Smith building, which is where I work at BYU. And for the first 3 times, they said no, because again, I'm not sure they fully understood what it was, and just because there's like a heroic marble white statue of Joseph Smith like 3 feet to the left. And so they thought that maybe that wouldn't quite fit the actual decor. But then last year I applied to have this displayed, and I think I was the only one who applied, so I got footed in. So, so basically this is kind of the recording of the 88 Temples of Shikoku. And it's there to basically show the devotion of thousands of people in even modern Japan who, by any means of transportation, but certainly the hundreds that walk the journey, the 1,200-kilometer journey, and basically collect these cards and stamps on the scroll or in a book as basically a sign of devotion. And we want them to, in some ways, engage that and understand what would cause someone, through some sort of belief in both the Buddha or in Buddhism, but especially in Kobodaishi, to complete this journey. So we've had that up for about 6 months. I think it's been received quite well. We've got a little bit extra funding to digitize it, and so I'll send you guys a link when we finish that. So it'll basically look like this. We'll take high-res photographs of it, and then you can basically click on any of the cards or any of the stamps, and it'll make a pop-up window to the temple. And you can get background on the temple, you get background on what the icon is. You can basically tell where you are in the journey, how long you've come from the last temple, how far it is to the next. If you started at one, how many kilometers you've traveled. And so each place in which the temple is mentioned on the display will take you to that. And then if you click the bottom things about the pilgrim's transaction or on the clothing, it'll open up a pop-up window and show you more information on that. We're really excited about that. And within that kind of funding, we have proposed to do this. We're still not quite there. Let me just show you a couple of these. This is actually something that's going on in Shikoku right now. This is what's called Stepping on Sand, or Sunafumi. And basically it's a miniaturization of the pilgrimage, where you can basically look at the icon of each of the temples of Shikoku, the 88 temples. You can see there's Fudo-myo and Kannon is very popular. Jizo is there, right? Shakyamuni, Shakyamuni, and even the Healing Buddha is there, right? So, and it just gives you basically this time to engage in the pilgrimage and to have some sort of small kind of connection of enrichment and of kind of, I guess you could say, spiritual connection to why people actually do this pilgrimage. Let me show you a couple other ones really quick. It has less music that's a little bit jarring. So this is one that's outside in Hokkaido. And again, you can see basically the icons there, and then you have the pavers on the ground. And underneath the paver is supposed to be sand from the temple of Shikoku. Here's an indoor version of that, right? Again, the black marble tiles basically tell you which temple it is, and there's sand underneath. This is one of my favorites. Not that one. No, it's a nice one. I'm not saying it's not a favorite. It's one of the favorites. This is one of my favorites. It's in suburban Osaka, and it has one part of the temple that is supposed to represent hell, and then this part of the temple is supposed to represent heaven. And so you can see that you're supposed to go down into this cave, and then down in the cave there's this really kind of interesting kind of stained glass mandala and a bunch of different icons. And it's nice and cool down there, so it's kind of fun. But there's actually a Shikoku pilgrimage replication or miniaturization right here. It's it's right in front of us, right? Which is why I really like this, because if you don't know what you're looking for, you may miss it. So if you look basically here, and again, the picture is really not that easy to see, but on the right-hand side, you'll see behind the railing, behind the railing, numbers 21, 22, 23, 24. And here on this side, you can see as you come back out, there is 88 that ends the railing on this side. So that's my closest view of it. But if you get close and look at it, you can actually see that the sand is of a different type and a different color. So that as you go down the railing and grab it, you're actually grabbing the sand of the 88 temples and kind of replicating the journey as you go down into heaven, which is kind of a really cool Buddhist thing, that you actually go down into heaven. Anyway. It's a different kind of, but like I said, we've received initial funding. We'll need a lot more, but hopefully by 2022 that we'll put this up at BYU, which will be our own kind of version of replication that allows people to have an immersive and enriching experience. So that's kind of the next step in kind of our ways in which we can kind of, or ways in which I can in some ways give not only my students, but a fairly kind of homogeneous well, in Utah, certainly this kind of opportunity would not be available otherwise. So that's what I'm really excited about, is to be able to have people understand the devotion of Shikoku and to, in some ways, appreciate it in a kind of immersive and enriching way. And so it's basically just the same idea, right? Is it this idea that you would have 88 stations like this in which you can actually step on the sand, see the sand as you step on it, and in some ways understand the devotional practice of Shikoku. That's kind of where my research and my class is at the current date. And I would just say that perhaps my situation is anomalous because of the aims of a BYU education, the opportunities it has to bring Buddhism as a spiritual engagement, or as an experience. But I think there's little things that we can do, especially I think in the readings of Jushi and having our students engage texts as a transformative experience, and in basically emphasizing religious exemplars. I often call them my religious geniuses, and have our students understand them as such, as special individuals that are living or have lived, that in some ways we can learn from and that we can in some ways try to emulate in small ways.